This is the first recording for the chapter on blood, the first component of the cardiovascular system. And blood is a tissue, one of the connective tissues, specifically a liquid connective tissue, which is moving throughout the circulatory system or the cardiovascular system. And in this we're going to look at the functions of blood and then just give a quick overview of the rest of the topics for this chapter. The three functions of blood that we're going to look at in some detail are transportation, regulation, and protection. The cardiovascular system, of course, is moving blood throughout the body. As the heart pumps, it pushes the blood through the blood vessels. And the point of that movement of the blood is largely to distribute oxygen, which is needed for all tissues to generate energy through mitochondrial processes. The oxygen comes in through the lungs, dissolves into the blood, and then is pumped out to the rest of the body by way of the heart. It's also going to transport nutrient molecules, which are absorbed from the GI tract, primarily the small intestine, and again delivered throughout the body cells. And then all of those body cells, in doing their various functions, will produce metabolic wastes, which are then going to be cleared from the body. Now, the lungs are for getting rid of carbon dioxide gas through exhalation. The kidneys filter out the blood to remove wastes, mostly small molecules. And the liver is important not to remove metabolic wastes, but rather to detoxify the blood. So, for instance, if you had an aspirin today, the active molecule in aspirin needs to be broken down into a different molecule so it's not as active and possibly toxic to your body. And then finally, also, the blood is responsible for transporting a number of signaling molecules like hormones around the body. The blood is responsible for regulation, of which there are many things that could be explained. But the two I want to point out here, because they're rather important topics that are covered at various points in A&P, is regulating pH of bodily fluids and regulating body temperature. Now, one important part of regulating pH, keeping the acidity or alkalinity of the bodily fluids under control, are molecules called buffers. And what buffers do is they help to keep pH in the normal range, close to 7. It's about 7.35 in blood. And so, for example, when the blood is getting acidotic, when the pH is dropping, a buffer like bicarbonate will be able to basically bind up the excess hydrogen ions, and clear them out of the blood. There are other things that provide buffers for the system. For instance, within red blood cells, hemoglobin buffers the accumulation of hydrogen ions in the blood cell itself. Bicarbonate works out in the plasma. And then for body temperature, blood is very important. When we're cold, we move the blood away from the skin so we don't radiate off excess heat and overly cool our body. When we're hot, we do the opposite. The blood moves into the skin so that we can radiate off that heat. And then also the blood's the basis for sweat that's filtered out in sweat glands. And the water on the surface of the skin from the sweat will be evaporated away using the energy drawn out from the blood in the skin, which is going to help cool off the body. There are a number of other regulatory processes that are associated with the blood. Blood sugar levels, blood calcium levels, all sorts of different things. And a lot of that we'll look at in relation to the kidney, where most of those homeostatic mechanisms are regulated. Blood can be said to have protective qualities also. Two rather obvious parts of that, perhaps. One is sort of internal. The blood is kept within the circulatory system which is closed. And any time that blood leaks out of that system, something needs to stop it from being from draining away. And that's what we call blood clotting or hemostasis. Don't confuse hemostasis with the word homeostasis. They sound very similar, but one means blood clotting and the other one means maintenance of the internal environment. And then also blood is related to protection of the whole body as its role in immunity. One of the major players in immunity are white blood cells, so obviously from their name they are part of the blood, and they're often transported throughout the body by the blood. They move into other tissues and have other effects, but at their root they're part of the blood. Moving through the rest of the presentations for this chapter, we're going to move on to looking at the composition of the blood, the major components that make it up, and look at some specific molecules we find in the plasma. And then we're going to look at the clinical test to separate the components of blood out, which is called the hematocrit. Then we'll go on, basically extending the components of the blood to look specifically at the formed elements, which are the cellular components of the blood. We'll concentrate on red blood cells as a major portion of that. The white blood cells will be saved mostly to talk about within the immune system, and then we'll talk about platelets more in terms of how they relate to blood clotting. And then we'll go on to look at blood clotting in some detail, the steps involved in it, and some of the important players that are responsible for the maintenance of a closed circulatory system. And then we'll end with looking at blood typing, and especially how that's important for the medical practice of transfusion of blood. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. So the common buffer that we find in the plasma is bicarbonate. It's the same sort of buffer that you find in a pill like Tums, and it's going to be important in buffering the plasma, especially as we start looking at its relationship to the respiratory, urinary, and digestive systems. Now, hemoglobin is also a choice in here, but it's not correct because hemoglobin's a buffer only within the red blood cells. Now, that can have an impact on the plasma, but an indirect one at best.